Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to Becoming Sister Wives Book Club. Today it's all about Mary. I will be giving my commentary on the first part of chapter 5 entitled Mary, of course. Mary idealized the idea of sister wives like most women who enter into plural marriage. She was eager for her first sister wife to become her bestie, in addition to being married to her hubby, Cody. Mary felt it would be the most natural thing in the world to form an instantaneous friendship with her sister wife. Of course, I'm sure it's a just add water type of easy when the Insta-friends are married to the same man, vying for his time and attention and investment and affection. It makes total sense. Of course you'd want to be friends with your husband's other wife. Best friends. It's only natural, right? Mary never wanted to be in a situation with a sister wife who didn't want to be involved and close with the rest of the family. Mary admits she is opinionated, but she's also reserved. And she says that makes her cautious about making close friendships with women very quickly. To form relationships, she needs to feel safety and trust before she can develop a deep relationship and open up all the way. When Mary forms a deep relationship, she values it and expects that friendship or relationship to last. Mary mentions the first courtship that she and Cody entered into. I believe she is referring to the minor 17-year-old girl that Cody courted before the wedding was called off a week before it was supposed to happen. Mary says they were introduced to her at a church gathering. She refers to her as a young woman. Is 17 a young woman? 17 isn't even an adult yet by law. Cody and Mary courted her and almost married her, but apparently it was called off a week before the wedding. In Utah, by the way, it's statutory rape for a 17-year-old and an 18-plus age person to get together, even if they were, and no intimacy happened, as they put it, and there was definitely no intimacy involved. Is it appropriate for a 20 or 21 or 22-year-old man, who's definitely over 18, to date a 17-year-old with intention to marry and wait till she turns 18, the age of a legal adult, to do the engagement? Does an 18-year-old know who she is, the world, life, anything? Is an 18-year-old ready to decide to marry an older man and change their religion that practices plural marriage and pop out kids without understanding the long-term consequences or the big picture of those decisions? Is that fair of Cody and Mary, knowing they are a little older and wiser than this minor girl? Just some thoughts, but Mary was excited about this 17-year-old girl she refers to as the young woman she met at the church gathering who was recruited into the faith by Christine. Mary and the 17-year-old became friends right away. Mary says this was unusual for her to make friends so quickly, so she immediately took that as a sign that she and Cody were destined to marry her. Remember when I said everything that they think and feel is not attributed to them and their chemical releases and emotions? Everything is attributed to God and a sign or symbol from God. Everything is spiritual or perceived as such, as the supernatural having a drive in it. So because Mary is cautious and she never makes fast friends, and with this 17-year-old, she made fast friends and it was different from the norm for Mary, Mary assumed that indicated they were destined to marry this girl. It was bigger than her, from outside of her, from God, that she was able to make friends so quickly with her. That's how she perceived it, that now because they made fast friends, she had to marry this girl with Cody. It was destiny. It wasn't just that this 17-year-old girl was young and shy and impressionable, and she had just converted or pondered converting, and Christine brought this girl from another state to this church gathering where she knew no one, so maybe she was being extra friendly. Mary came along and was friendly and welcoming and polite. So this naive, vulnerable, and impressionable 17-year-old girl who just wanted to fit in socially and make friends was probably open and friendly back to Mary, and Mary didn't feel a wall up or threatened by this younger person. And because they made fast friends, that was a sign from God to Mary that this person is a person you and your husband are destined to marry. In life, you will find people who are just completely on your wavelength, that you just vibe with, and you can put your guard down faster because you get each other. It's not destiny or a sign from God to marry them. Mary and this girl loved chilling, and they spent lots of time together without Cody. Mary thought they were on their way to achieving the ideal sister-wife relationship she always imagined having. Mary admits there were times when she got jealous when the girl and Cody would go off together alone in the afternoons. This minor girl was from out of state, so if she relocated to Utah, where did she live? If Mary spent most of her days with her and Cody spent the afternoons with her, was she living with Cody and Mary as a minor? Mary did her best to deal with her jealousy maturely. Mary felt confident about their future together, that this girl would make a wonderful wife to Cody and a best friend to her. Things didn't work out, and Mary was devastated when the courtship went bad and the minor left. The wedding was called off a week before, so I wonder what happened to sour things so close to the wedding date. Mary says they were all so young. She says the girl was only 18, and she and Cody were only in their first year of marriage, so they may have mistaken a crush for love. She was 17 when they courted the girl, and Cody would spend afternoons alone with her, and they had to wait for her to turn 18 to do the engagement. Mary felt personally betrayed when it didn't work out. She lost her closest friend and a person she thought would be her ideal sister wife. Cody and Mary, as a couple, put their failed courtship behind them. It wasn't just a courtship. They had to wait for the girl to turn 18 to get engaged to her, and then the whole thing was called off just 1 week before the wedding. So it was a little bit more than just a courtship. I mean, they were engaged and almost married. Mary says she and Cody were still a fun-loving, goofy, romantic couple, just like they always were. But they felt adding another wife to their family was something they needed to accomplish sooner rather than later to stick with their commitment to living the principle of plural marriage. Cody and Mary made this promise to each other when they married. They were committed to plural marriage. They loved each other. They had a wonderful, stable relationship, according to Mary, but they knew plural marriage was their destiny. Mary isn't sure when she noticed that Janelle wanted to join their family. She had known Janelle for several years since Janelle was married to her brother. Mary explains that she and Janelle had a cordial relationship even after Janelle's divorce from Mary's brother, Adam. She still saw Janelle as a sister-in-law, and it never occurred to her that Janelle would one day be her sister wife. Mary says if Cody had feelings about Janelle beyond anything platonic, he never told her about it. Mary knew Cody valued Janelle's intellect and work ethic, and he had a deep respect for how Janelle conducted herself emotionally. Mary was surprised when Janelle approached Cody and asked to join their family, but she wasn't unpleasantly surprised. Janelle was already close with Mary's family, and she was one of the people that she and Cody associated with on a regular basis. To me, the way Mary writes this, she isn't writing this as if she is friendly with Janelle and really appreciates her and is very enthusiastic about this. She was one of the people that she and Cody associated with regularly. That's what Mary said. And Cody never said anything other than platonic about Janelle. So she never saw any romantic sparks between them, and Cody never seemed to refer to Janelle in that type of way. Mary says it didn't feel like a big leap to imagine Janelle as a permanent fixture in their family or in their lives. Mary writes, I have to admit, part of me was relieved that Cody and Janelle weren't a conventionally romantic couple. I didn't feel that Janelle's presence in our lives in any way threatened the love Cody and I shared. Their bond was intellectual, which made it easier for me to accept Janelle. If they had been one of those gushy, lovey-dovey couples who melt at the sight of each other, if they had been the same kind of couple Cody and I were, I would have had a lot more trouble making peace with the idea of her as a sister wife. In the episode on Professor Yankowiak's study, we learn the ideal of the faith for plural marriage is harmonious familial love among the group over romantic love. And romantic love and focusing on the pair bond and the romantic love of a couple contradicts with the harmonious familial love God wants for the adherents of the faith. Here, Mary is saying because Cody and Janelle weren't a traditional romantic couple, she didn't feel threatened by her, and she was able to make peace with Janelle being a sister wife. So because it wasn't romantic and there wasn't that type of chemistry and vibe between Janelle and Cody, it was easier for Mary. She had less emotions like jealousy or insecurity to overcome. So here she is admitting that she and Cody were a romantic, lovey-dovey couple, and because Janelle and Cody weren't romantic, it was okay to bring Janelle into the fold for her. Notice how she wants to be the only marriage relationship in the group that is romantic. And providing the other pair isn't of a romantic nature, it's okay for her. She can stomach it. It just shows that despite this commitment to plural marriage and the faith putting harmonious familial love as the priority, where romantic love is viewed as a liability and jealousy and insecurity are weaknesses to overcome to be your best self and live in accordance with how God wants them to, there is still a natural instinct for romantic love. And Mary was able to be okay with Janelle and keep her emotions at bay with the comfort of knowing Janelle and Cody weren't romantic. Even though plural marriage and their whole faith is about putting the group first, romantic love, and seeking to attain harmonious familial love among the group over romantic love and overcoming those emotions are seen as weaknesses to overcome to make you your best self. And that's the ideal of the faith, to overcome the jealousy, the suffering, the envy, the competition, the hierarchy, the insecurity, all of the suffering that goes along with that. Mary's primary instinct is maintaining her pair bond with Cody and her status as the wife with the romantic love bond, even though that's not how she should be perceiving this according to the faith she grew up in. She can't deny human instinct and nature to want to be the only object of her husband's affection, naturally, and she acknowledges Janelle was less threatening and more acceptable to her because she knew it wasn't romantic, it wasn't a threat to her. Mary writes, I immediately saw that Cody and I would have one type of relationship, the passionate, romantic one we'd always had, while he and Janelle would have another, something more cerebral. This seemed both totally acceptable to me and easier to handle as our first move into plural marriage. After 3 years of monogamous marriage, Mary thought she was ready to add a sister wife. She was happy Cody found a wife he was compatible with on an intellectual level. Mary was happy Janelle chose Cody and that Cody chose her because Cody was a wonderful man. After Janelle's failed relationship with her brother, Cody and Janelle wanted to have their wedding day on Mary's birthday, and Mary found that difficult for her. To be honest, I think it is rude and unfair and disrespectful and insensitive to do Cody's wedding to another wife, Janelle, on the birthday of his first wife, on both Janelle and Cody's parts. I don't think it's appropriate to have a reminder of something like that on one's birthday. And also imagine having Mary's birthday and Cody and Janelle's wedding anniversary on the same day. That's a nightmare. Janelle and Cody thought it wouldn't be a big deal, apparently. In hindsight, Mary realizes that a lot of her issues with Cody and Janelle's marriage were because she thought they were being very insensitive. Birthdays are important to Mary, and we can see that from the show. Mary writes, I felt like I was being completely overlooked, even when they offered to celebrate their future anniversaries on a different day. It floored me that my husband would think this was a good idea. But it baffled me even more to know that a woman who was wanting to join our family would even think for a minute to do it on the birthday of a future sister wife. Fortunately, Cody's mom got involved and persuaded them to move their wedding to the day after my birthday. So here is an example where Mary, Cody's first wife, didn't matter to him and her voice wasn't heard, and she wasn't taken into consideration by either Cody or Janelle. As a woman and a friend to Mary who knew her whole family and was married previously to Mary's brother, I'm sure Janelle knew Mary was big on birthdays and that she wouldn't appreciate Cody and Janelle's wedding on her birthday. It's highly insensitive in my opinion. No one listened to Mary's voice. It wasn't until Cody's mom stepped in that Cody and Janelle were willing to change the date of the wedding to the day after her birthday. I was under the impression that the resentment between Janelle and Mary started with the way Mary treated Janelle when Janelle came into the household, and that Mary was overbearing, wanting things done her way, being dominant with Janelle, trying to control how Janelle does things like chores. I knew it had nothing to do with Mary being upset that Janelle used to be married to Adam, her brother, and it was years after her divorce that Janelle married Cody. So Janelle did not divorce Adam, Mary's brother, because of some love triangle with Cody or because she fell for Cody, despite the rumors that go around. And we know Janelle remained close with Adam's family, and with Mary. And even when Janelle divorced Mary's brother, they were still on good terms, and they even attended functions together post-separation, like Mary and Cody's wedding. So did the issues with Mary start with Cody and Janelle's insensitivity, or with Mary being overbearing and dominant with Janelle? This is Mary's perception of what happened, and Janelle has said on the show that Mary was very difficult and demanding and overbearing. She would complain about how to fold things, wanting them folded her way. She would complain about how the dishes were loaded in the dishwasher. She called Janelle lazy when she wouldn't participate in the group cooking and cleaning. And Janelle wasn't confident in her domestic skills. So being accused of laziness or ineptitude in those areas probably made Janelle feel demeaned and incapable. So we know from the show now, she just completely disengages and doesn't participate when the group cooks or cleans. She acknowledges she has other skills in the last episode of the rewatch. In a situation, there are always three sides, each person's perception, and then there's the truth in the middle somewhere. Did the poor dynamic between Mary and Janelle start with Janelle's insensitivity to Mary during the courtship, or did it start with Mary being overbearing and dominant with Janelle in the household? Or was Mary's guard up? Was she hurt by the insensitivity repeatedly shown to her? So when Janelle entered the house, did Mary assume a dominant position to try and keep herself from being hurt or controlled or overpowered? Who knows? Everything has to be taken with a grain of salt, of course, since there are so many contradictions. Mary says she realized on Cody and Janelle's wedding day, she wasn't as prepared to take on a sister wife as she thought she would be. They had a quick courtship, so on the wedding day, Mary was struck by the realization that she would be sharing her husband. She says despite the strong commitment to the principle of plural marriage, the first time that hits you, it's a huge shock. It was much harder than Mary thought it would be, since for 3 years, she and Cody had been inseparable and living monogamously, and now there would be a new person involved permanently in their home. Mary was sad, and it was magnified by the fact that Cody and Janelle were leaving for the honeymoon. It's interesting how Cody knew that he would have to have some sort of honeymoon ready for Janelle and for Mary. He didn't forget about the honeymoon either. With Janelle or Mary, he remembered, even though the honeymoon was just a road trip. But for wife number 3, Christine, Cody totally forgot, and he was unaware there needed to be a honeymoon, and he blamed his wives for not letting him know he needed to have a honeymoon with Christine on the 3rd marriage. So he was aware with wife number 1 and wife number 2 that he needed to do a honeymoon, but wife number 3 he forgot and blamed his wives for not reminding him. Maybe he thought he could get away with not having a honeymoon at all. Mary says she and Cody spent every moment together and they never were apart. And now Cody was leaving for a week with Janelle. Janelle said on the show her honeymoon was 3 or 4 days. Mary says it was a week. Who knows? Anyways, Cody pulled Mary aside before taking off with Janelle for their honeymoon, and he gave her some mad money to spend enjoying herself while he was away. He wanted her to have fun while he was off with another woman. Mary says Cody's gesture was sweet and touching, and her plan was to hole up in a hotel room to make sense of her complicated feelings and to wonder who she was now that she wasn't identified as just Mary and Cody. When Mary's parents learned of her plan to hole up in misery, they invited her to stay with them. Mary didn't want to burden anyone with her emotions, but her parents insisted, so Mary went. Her mom knew that Mary was struggling inside and that she needed people around her. Despite her sadness, Mary was happy to go, and the time passed more quickly, being surrounded by family rather than being alone, and Cody called Mary every day to check in. When Janelle came into the family, Cody and Mary were naive regarding living the principle of plural marriage. They saw it through rose-colored glasses. They didn't know how to prepare for the emotional and domestic reality of their new situation. Cody and Mary both assumed that after the honeymoon, they would live with Janelle as one big happy family and that everything would return to normal. Mary writes, "Neither Cody nor I anticipated the need to change our behavior when Janelle came into the house. We didn't consider how he might have to balance the relationship he had with me with the one he was developing with Janelle. I never took the time to think about how I should open up my space, both physical and emotional, to accommodate a new wife." If Mary grew up in the lifestyle, how could she not know on some level that both she and Cody would have to adjust to the new normal and adjust their behavior and the way they function to incorporate Janelle? It seems pretty obvious. I think Cody and Mary assumed that they could function the same way they did monogamously, and Janelle would just have to accept it and be the third wheel. And if Cody didn't prepare himself and Mary to adapt to Janelle and incorporate her, he definitely wasn't being the best husband or self-proclaimed leader he claims to be. It makes me wonder what they added Janelle for. Was it out of convenience because Janelle was the breadwinner wife? One has to wonder. Mary says she felt she was welcoming to Janelle, but she didn't realize just how different their personalities were. They moved into a new house at the time of Janelle's wedding, so Mary thought of the house as her home and also Cody and Janelle's home collectively, not just as her home exclusively. Mary didn't think of the house as her house. When they were all picking bedrooms, Mary offered Janelle the master bedroom, thinking it would be special to have for Janelle as a newlywed, and she took a small bedroom at the back of the house. Mary didn't know Janelle didn't usually speak up for herself for what she needed. So Mary isn't sure, even to this day, if that gesture by her was important to Janelle or appreciated by her. Mary assumed Janelle would feel free to behave with Cody as she did with him, and she didn't realize she too had to change her behavior at times. In my opinion, here Mary is referring to affection. As we know from Janelle's point of view, Mary was all over Cody and very affectionate at all times. And Janelle recounted an experience of watching a movie with Mary and Cody, and they were on the couch together, curled up, nestled together under a blanket, as she sat off to the side feeling like a third wheel. And we know PDA isn't Janelle's thing, and affection isn't her thing, so she probably didn't feel comfortable being affectionate with Cody in Mary's presence. We know from the camping trip episode with Janelle and Cody that Janelle only realized in the past few years how important affection and PDA was for Cody. So she had to learn to accommodate Cody in that way and to become more comfortable with it. So seeing Mary all over Cody all the time was probably less than comfortable for Janelle, since she wasn't comfortable with that level of affection with Cody in front of Mary. To Janelle, it probably felt like the dog pissing all over the fire hydrant, marking their territory, and like Mary was claiming Cody with that behavior. And it may have felt threatening to Janelle, or it may have created insecurities for her. Mary says the biggest mistake she and Cody made when marrying Janelle was all moving in together right away and not giving Janelle and Cody enough time to develop their relationship, and not having enough time for both herself and Janelle to nurture their relationship. Having everyone in the same house meant Janelle had to be face to face every day with Cody and Mary's romantic relationship and affection. Mary admits that she and Cody were too naive to hide their affection from Janelle. So Janelle was regularly a witness to their PDA, and Mary admits it must have been painful and awkward. Mary says she and Cody would hold hands and hug, and it would leave Janelle feeling uncomfortable. Mary writes, "Although Janelle is by no means as physically affectionate a person as I am, it was not healthy or fair for her to see the affection I shared with Cody. I'm sure this led to hard feelings towards me. Living together from the start ultimately shortchanged the 3 relationships we were trying to develop and maintain." Another reason that Cody and Janelle had difficulties laying the foundation for their marriage during that first year was that they were essentially living under a veil of secrecy. Cody was simply unable to acknowledge Janelle as his wife outside of our church community. They were very private about their family life, and Mary acknowledges that didn't help Janelle feel secure in her position in the family. When the family went out together, Janelle was introduced as Cody's sister. Gross. Who calls their wife their sister, even out of fear? Call her a family friend, anything, but not a sister. How do you pretend to be your husband's sister? Why didn't they just say she was Mary's sister or a cousin or something? At church, they would acknowledge Janelle as a wife, and everywhere else, Janelle was Cody's sister. Why not something more palatable for Janelle, like a family friend? Anything but to have to pretend like your husband is your brother in public everywhere. That's too much. It would make more sense to be Mary's sister at least. Mary recalls on more than one occasion having conversations with Cody and Janelle about what to call Janelle in public. Mary and Cody lived in a small community in Wyoming when Janelle married in, so they felt they had to have an explanation for Janelle. Mary realizes it wasn't fair to Cody and Janelle to explain that Janelle was her husband's sister in public. Because Janelle's mom was married to Cody's dad, that explanation that Janelle was Cody's sister seemed plausible, and Janelle seemed okay with it. Mary always felt uncomfortable with this explanation, but Cody and Janelle seemed to be good with it, so Mary was good with it too, but she felt it was a huge disservice to Cody and Janelle's marriage. Mary felt separation anxiety that put a strain on her relationship with Cody, and it made her act unfairly at times with Janelle and with Cody after Cody and Janelle married. Mary missed the privacy of monogamy and the luxuries of making a romantic dinner for two or curling up on the couch watching a movie together whenever she wanted. She says all of that ends when you add another wife and you all live in the same house. It ends because it is viewed as preferential treatment, and Mary says preferential treatment isn't acceptable in a plural marriage. So preferential treatment isn't okay, according to Mary. It's not acceptable in plural marriage. Have we seen Cody give preferential treatment to any of his wives? How about Cody and Robin's wedding reception and the level of investment and interest Cody showed with every fine detail, including picking the dress, when he didn't do that with any other wife? What about the different courtship standards with Robin, like kissing pre-altar when all the other wives, save Mary, who was the first wife, waited to kiss Cody because it wasn't appropriate to kiss a married man? What about the honeymoon? Robin got an 11-day trip to paradise. Mary got a few-day road trip. Janelle got a 3 or 4 day road trip, according to her. Mary says it was a week. Either way, it was a simple road trip. With Christine, hell, it just skipped Cody's mind, and he threw her in the back of a car and drove around the sticks of Montana with her, having a morose, heavy vibe to him, not being happy he was there. It didn't matter that it's a commonly held notion that when you marry, you go on a honeymoon. It just skipped his mind. It didn't matter that wives 1 and 2, Cody knew to plan a honeymoon for. With wife 3, it just skipped his mind, and he didn't know he should plan to go on a honeymoon at all. And he said his wives didn't let him know Christine should have a honeymoon, so he forgot. This was his third go-around, and he forgot, so he threw Christine in the car in a pissy mood, and he drove her around the sticks of Montana for their honeymoon. But fourth wife Robin, he painstakingly planned an 11-day honeymoon to paradise, crossing off bucket list items, happy to be there, fully in the pool, all the way invested, all the way present and enthusiastic. When they were hugging and swaying, practically dry humping, glued at the lips, at family-friendly tourist attractions and on every street corner of San Diego, did Cody have that morose vibe and that 1,000-yard stare and the weight of the world on his shoulders like he did with Christine? There are a million more instances of preferential treatment, but here Mary says preferential treatment is not okay. But the favorite wife is obvious, and the preferential treatment smacks you in the face like you just ate a ghost pepper. It's so obvious. Here Mary says clearly it's not okay to have any preferential treatment in plural marriage. So it's interesting that in the Brown dynamic, we see an exorbitant amount of it between Cody and Robin exclusively. There's preferential treatment galore. Mary admits she did not handle the stress of the situation as she should have. She didn't know how to hold back or temper her opinions. She's direct, and when she has a strong opinion, she can be harsh. That I understand because I can be the same way sometimes, but I am always conscious of it, so I try my best to consider others in my delivery. And it's not always perfect, but I try, and I'm very aware of it. And I appreciate that it seems Mary is trying to be honest here. But if she admits this, I wonder the extent really and how bad it really was. Was it just having strong opinions, or was it about asserting domination and control? Because those are two different things. Mary writes, "Since I see things in black and white, I have a bad habit of phrasing things in a way that can come across as aggressive." Janelle, on the other hand, is quite non-confrontational and seems to have a hard time being honest with herself or with others about her feelings. I'd tell Janelle that this is how it needs to be, and didn't realize I was offering her no space to voice her own concerns. I didn't intend to be mean. I wasn't even aware that coming across that way. I was being honest with my thoughts and feelings and just assumed she would do the same. First of all, most things in the world are gray. And secondly, regardless of how much conviction you feel or how blunt one is or how strong their opinions are, you have to understand that your opinions may be right for you and your life experiences and perceptions, but they won't be right for everyone with another set of life experiences. And it doesn't make the other person wrong and you right. And you also have to be willing to shift your opinion as you live and experience new things. And you learn nothing is just black and white and set in stone. You always have to be willing to listen and put yourself in the other's shoes, seeing things from their perspective. To tell someone this is how it needs to be, it's my way, end of story, can make the person on the receiving end feel so intimidated that they don't feel that they can voice their opinion or that the other party is willing to listen or understand their feelings and compromise. So sometimes people just keep quiet to avoid a storm because they know they won't be heard, their voice won't matter, and it will just create a commotion with more animosity and nothing changed or different. Mary doesn't seem like the type of person to be flexible and open to compromise, and anything other than what she suggests will be perceived by her as a rejection or aggression. She, at some point, in my opinion, must have felt she had no power in her life. She may feel if she compromises, Janelle will take her power and she may have to bend, and she doesn't see bending as compromise. She probably sees it as giving up power or control, but that's just my take. Janelle knows Mary will force her way, and she knows Mary won't compromise or weigh her input anyways. So putting up a fight and dealing with the wrath of Mary probably wasn't worth the drama for her since she knew how things would go. It's interesting. A paragraph or two ago, Mary says she felt she welcomed Janelle and she even gave her the master bedroom as a gesture since Janelle was a newlywed. Yet she also tells Janelle this is how it needs to be. It needs to be her way, in fact. She was also marking her territory with Cody being overly affectionate in front of Janelle. So despite the welcoming gesture, how welcome could Janelle possibly feel? Janelle likes things chill and peaceful. She values that. She doesn't seem to like discord and conflict and emotions up and down. And Mary was probably overbearing and rigid. And last episode of the rewatch, Janelle mentioned that she would get called lazy when she didn't participate in the group chores like cooking or cleaning because she felt lost. It wasn't her skill set and she would disengage. So if you don't like conflict and people are going to bulldoze you and you know even if you speak up you won't be heard or considered, no compromise will be made, you just make it easier on yourself and you start staying quiet knowing if you speak up, the end result won't be different and there will just be more animosity. It probably felt like walking on eggshells for Janelle, but that's just my feeling. Mary remembers having many conversations with Janelle regarding all of the household and communal stuff, from how the house should be decorated to the finances. Mary would give Janelle her thoughts about how things should be handled, and she assumed if Janelle took issue or saw otherwise, she would voice her thoughts as well. Mary would always find out later from Cody if Janelle had an issue or disagreement. Mary was so upset that Janelle never just directly told her her opinions during the discussions between them about the matters at hand. Including Cody for Janelle was kind of a triangulation, but Janelle probably knew if she told Mary directly, it would go nowhere and change nothing. They would still do things Mary's way. The only difference would be added hostility or resentment and frustration. So Janelle would probably wait and tell Cody and let Cody deal with Mary since Cody had a voice with Mary and Mary would be more willing to compromise for him. For Cody, it probably added a lot of tension and stress and frustration, and it probably weighed on him and affected his individual relationships with Mary and Janelle, particularly if they were using him as the go-between to communicate and stand up for them in their point of view. And it might feel to each wife like Cody was taking sides while he was mediating things. Mary and Janelle should have talked directly, but Mary probably made it impossible and very intimidating for Janelle, and Janelle really doesn't like conflict, especially being practical, knowing conflict with Mary would accomplish nothing but adding more tension to the situation. So Janelle probably felt she had no choice to be heard. To reach any type of compromise, she had to go through Cody, and that probably put Cody in a very tough spot walking that line. Mary felt Janelle communicating through Cody and not directly with her was a betrayal and that Janelle was lying to her. Mary felt they were in the marriage together to have a close relationship that was open, and Mary didn't understand why Janelle wouldn't communicate honestly with her And Mary felt that she was communicating honestly with Janelle, but Janelle wasn't being honest with her in her direct communications with Mary. Mary hadn't learned yet to be softer in her delivery and less overbearing. The shaky friendship between Janelle and Mary deteriorated even further in the months after Janelle's marriage to Cody. Mary wanted to work on improving her relationship with Janelle now that Janelle was in the family. She says she wanted and expected to have a close sister-wife friendship with Janelle. She realized it wouldn't happen early on because Janelle was reserved towards her friendship-wise. So Mary realized they wouldn't have that close sister-wife bond she hoped for. It's interesting to me that Mary used the word expected. She wanted and expected to have a special sister-wife bond with Janelle. It's fine to want and hope for that sister-wife bond, but to expect it is a lot, especially when you are overbearing and overcritical to the point where the sister-wife you want to be close to is too intimidated to speak up, and also probably doesn't speak up because she knows there is no point. It's a futile effort. So then she has to involve Cody. So did Mary expect she would just be HBIC as first wife and that she should have a leadership position over Janelle and that they would still have that special sister-wife bond she hoped for, that she expected? Did she expect Janelle to be like a sister to her regardless of how she treated Janelle? Perhaps as if her voice didn't matter or that she wouldn't be heard by her sister wife. So much so that she wouldn't speak up and she had to ask Cody. It's interesting because even in later seasons, Janelle and Mary are still working on their relationship to the point of going to counseling, and they try hard to have that bond, but there is so much resentment there and distrust as well on both sides that it's probably hard to develop that bond now. I wonder, with Christine leaving, if Mary and Janelle will unite in the family dynamic, or if Mary will gravitate to Robin and Cody and Janelle will be the odd one out. I think Mary will gravitate to Robin, but you never know. I think Janelle would make a better friend and a more genuine, loyal friend to Mary, but that's just my opinion. Around the time Mary realized she and Janelle wouldn't be close sister wives, a few months into Janelle's marriage with Cody, Cody took a job with Schwan Frozen Foods, and he was on the road for long stretches of time. Cat fight! So Janelle and Mary were home for long periods alone with Cody away, and they each made lists of grievances against each other for Cody to deal with later. Sheesh. Cody didn't have a lot of experience as a plural husband, and he didn't know how to negotiate between his two wives. What a fine line. That's not healthy for Cody or his wives, and it would definitely affect the relationship between Cody and his wives and between his wives. That triangulation isn't healthy for anyone involved or for the hierarchy or the dynamic of the family as a whole. Cody tried his best to handle the situation, and he was aware of the tension between Janelle and Mary, but everyone had to figure out their place and role in the family, and they had to learn to live together and love one another. Mary says during the early years, there were a lot of emotions all over the place for herself, Cody, and Janelle, especially between she and Janelle. Mary writes, in living plural marriage, you definitely have to go through a huge learning curve. Janelle and I had a lot of rough times in those early years. We both did and said things to each other that I'm sure we would like to forget. There is a lot of past history, things that I won't talk about in specifics in public out of my respect for Janelle and my desire to protect her. Even now, we still struggle with the residue of those early years. I truly hope that Janelle and I can work through some of those haunting issues of the past so they will stop recurring in our lives. Someday, when we're both ready, I hope it will happen. We know Janelle and Mary are still working on their relationship and doing counseling in some of the more current seasons, and it's improved to a small degree. But even when they were talking about who gets what land on Coyote Pass, Janelle was adamant that Mary not have access to the glorified drainage ditch on their property that they call a pond, because she was afraid Mary would limit access to everyone and be bothered by the extra traffic and noise in her yard. Janelle even tried to recruit Christine and even Cody to the cause. She even suggested making that piece of Coyote Pass a park of sorts for all of them, just so there were no issues, citing an issue in the Lehigh house where Mary made everyone go outside, down flights of stairs and across through the outside to access Christine's basement portion of the house, even in winter, rather than allowing everyone access to the basement door through her section of the big house. And that issue from so long ago created a lot of anxiety and worry for Janelle regarding preventing Mary from getting that property with the pond for fear of her preventing access to that pond for the rest of the family. If so many years later it was a huge concern for Janelle, then clearly not much has been resolved, in my opinion. I also think it's really interesting that Mary says, I won't talk about specifics in public out of my respect for Janelle and my desire to protect her. She's basically trying to almost hint or suggest that Janelle would look out of sorts or like the fault is on her and she's trying to protect Janelle, so she doesn't want to mention these things out of protecting Janelle when she's probably the one at fault for a lot of the animosity. So I think it's interesting that she writes that, trying to almost hint that she's protecting Janelle because Janelle would look batshit if she told what happened, kind of a thing. When really Mary is the one at fault and she probably doesn't want to mention it because she knows she will look bad. But that's just my opinion. Mary says, though Janelle brought tension to the home through no fault of her own, she also came with many strengths. Cody was busy with work, so Janelle encouraged Mary to look for a job, and she urged her to apply for a job at an engraver that Mary held for 10 years. She took Janelle up on her suggestion and she got to keep a job she really valued for 10 years. And moments like that helped Mary and Janelle to appreciate what could be in their relationship if it improved. During the first year that Janelle joined the family, Janelle got pregnant, and it was the most difficult emotional battle for Mary, who was married to Cody for 3 years monogamously before this and still wasn't pregnant. And she wanted a house filled with kids. And we know later that she had Mariah. But Mary had always hoped for more kids, and she had difficulty with that. So after 3 years of trying with no success, Mary was devastated to find out that Janelle got pregnant during the first year and before Mary, who wanted a child so much and she had been trying for so long. Mary saw how thrilled Cody was, and she tried to be happy about the first child coming into their family. But she felt betrayed by her own body. She felt let down and like a disappointment and a failure. Mary didn't know what was wrong with her, so she turned inward and she grew distant from Cody and Janelle. While Janelle was pregnant with their first child, Logan, the Brown family's first child, Cody began courting Christine. Christine, Mary, and Cody had all become friends when Mary first married Cody. And Mary says somehow she knew this courtship was inevitable. Remember, Cody said Mary told him many times she was not down to court Christine, and Cody wasn't that into her, but Christine was head over heels infatuated with Cody, and Cody was repulsed by her. But Christine was polygamy royalty. She had high status in the church. Christine's grandpa was the head of the church, and her dad was high up there, I believe, as well. He was involved with the church too. Christine only wanted Cody. She had lots of options and she turned them all down. And Christine's dad liked Cody a lot for his faith and athleticism. And Cody liked Christine's status and influence in their faith and in their church. And Mary knew Christine wanted Cody, and that would be one day despite how she felt, in my opinion. Cody's courtship with Christine was much more difficult on Mary than his courtship with Janelle had been. Mary says Janelle was never a threat to Cody and Mary's happiness together as a couple. Cody and Janelle were close friends. It wasn't romantic in nature or lovey-dovey like he and Mary were, so it wasn't as threatening or difficult to endure the courtship with Janelle. Mary says she knew Cody loved Janelle, but in a different way than he loved her. In other words, she knew Cody's love for Janelle wasn't a romantic love, so it made it more tolerable and acceptable to Mary because it wasn't a threat to Mary. And let's remember, harmonious love is the ideal of the faith, harmonious familial love. Having a harmonious family love and marriage isn't supposed to be about romantic love at all. Romantic love in that faith and in that structure is viewed as a liability since it butts heads or contradicts with the ideal harmonious family love that should be the focus and the priority and the faith ideal. Yet Mary could only stomach Janelle and not have the suffering and jealousy and insecurity with Janelle because she knew Janelle's love with Cody wasn't a romantic love like she and Cody shared. And that's how she was able to stomach tolerating Janelle, because she knew Janelle's love with Cody wasn't equal to hers, or a threat to her relationship with Cody because her relationship was romantic in nature and Janelle's wasn't, so they didn't compare and it wasn't a threat or a worry to Mary. But third wife Christine was. Mary says around Janelle, Cody never behaved romantically or lovey-dovey like he did with her, and she found that reassuring. I'm sure she did. When you love someone deeply, you want to know they only love you in that manner, and you only love them in that way, and that is exclusive to both partners in the couple and no one else. It's human nature to want monogamy. So when you know the other pair bond isn't romantic, it isn't so threatening because you are the only one connected in that romantic way that is instinctive for humans and natural to them. That exclusivity of a romantic relationship is natural, and wanting that is natural. When Janelle entered the family, nothing changed in Mary's relationship with Cody. Although the day-to-day nature of the marriage with Cody changed for Janelle, her relationship stayed exactly the same. Nothing had to shift. Even though they added a second wife, Mary didn't feel Cody loved her any less. With Christine, things were different. Christine was bubbly and young and energetic and flirtatious with Cody. Mary always suspected Cody was more than a little smitten with Christine. When Cody and Christine courted, Mary could tell Cody was beyond smitten with Christine. He was in love with her. Christine and Cody glowed around each other and they had fun goofing off together. Cody and Janelle's relationship was much less outwardly romantic, but with Christine, the relationship with Cody was grounded in an undeniable emotional attraction. Mary writes, when Cody proposed to Christine, I suddenly felt as if I were less important to him than I had been before. I felt threatened by their relationship and the friendship they'd built over the first 3 years of my marriage to Cody. Although she was our mutual friend, I always knew that Cody was somewhat taken with Christine. Cody seemed so much more engaged with Christine than he had been with Janelle. I think that he had learned from the experience of bringing Janelle into the family, how he needed to behave with Christine, how much more expressive and responsive he had to be to her wants and needs. He had gained knowledge from this relationship with Janelle and seemed much wiser when it came to courting Christine. He also seemed more devoted to the cause. At least, that's how it appeared to me. It cemented my feelings of inadequacy in our relationship when Cody called me only once while he and Christine were away on their honeymoon. So Mary says Cody was not just smitten, but in love with Christine, and they were goofy and flirtatious together, and there was chemistry there and emotional attraction, and she always knew Cody was taken with Christine. Cody says Christine was way into him and only wanted him, but Cody was initially just not that into her. He was hesitant to view her as a potential wife, making excuse after excuse. And Mary always rejected the idea of bringing Christine into the family. And Cody said earlier he was repulsed by Christine eating nachos. That nacho incident turned Cody off so much that it put the brakes on things. And Cody courted a minor Christine brought into their lives, and that wedding was called off a week before it was supposed to happen. Then Cody courted and married Janelle. Then he courted Christine, who was all the way in the pool, committed to wanting Cody all the way, enthused about it. She had high status in the church and many suitors, and she rejected them all, only wanting Cody, who was reluctant. He made excuses, and he knew her feelings for him, and yet he courted the minor that Christine brought into their lives without considering Christine's feelings. Then he courted and married Janelle, and he said he was grossed out by Christine, and then he decided to court Christine, and Christine's family was supportive, and they wanted Cody for Christine. Cody even called Christine after the wedding to Christine's minor friend was called off, and she thought he would finally want her, and instead, Cody told her Janelle was making him crazy, and he wanted to marry Janelle, and now finally, Christine is getting her way. And Mary is saying Cody was in love with Christine. But that's not what Cody said. And we know that Cody was doom and gloom at the wedding and during the honeymoon as well. And he married Christine knowing it was too soon and he wasn't sure of it because Christine insisted on getting married ASAP. She was so taken with him. There are so many different perspectives and accounts of the same thing. Cody didn't seem smitten. If he was smitten and so into Christine, Why did he try and marry her minor friend and then marry Janelle and then decide to court her? It's amazing how each wife in Cody perceives the same thing in a million different ways. And the truth lies somewhere in the middle, since these are all different perspectives based on the individual. I think a couple things are interesting about that quote from Mary. Mary felt threatened by Christine because she had what Mary perceived to be a romantic love and chemistry as well with Cody, so Mary sensed that as competition, as a possible threat. Mary felt less important to Cody, like she mattered less when Christine entered the picture. Cody was more engaged with Christine than he was with Janelle. He was more invested with Christine. And Mary noticed, and probably because Cody was giving more investment to Christine, Mary was getting less investment from Cody, or she perceived it as such. Also, Mary thinks Cody was more engaged because he learned from his experience with Janelle coming into the family. He improved and changed his behavior with Christine. He was more expressive and responsive to Christine's wants and needs. I think, first of all, it's interesting how anytime Cody behaves better with another wife than he did with them, the wives are very quick to say Cody learned and he improved as a man and as a husband in the lifestyle through his experiences. They never feel maybe that Cody was always capable of that ideal behavior and he is more invested just because he wants to be based on his level of emotional entanglement and feelings at the time that he has, not because he actually learned new tricks or grew as a person. It's kind of like when the wives noticed Cody's communication improved when he was away with Robin on the honeymoon. All the wives openly said it wasn't Robin's influence. It had nothing to do with her. It's because Cody grew as a husband from his experiences with them. It wasn't Robin at all, when in reality, it was Robin. She told Cody he was being stupid, that he had to grow up. He wanted to wait to call his wives, in fact, on the honeymoon and not call them every day. He didn't want to hear of their suffering or complaints, but Robin said he had to call every day, and so he did. And Robin helped him on what to say. Robin let Cody know what the wives needed to hear to feel connected and secure. All the while, his other wives were talking about how Cody has improved as a husband through learning from his experiences with them, and how it wasn't Robin's influence at all, when actually it was Robin. And they were trying to say it was all Cody and all Cody's growth and development. That shows Cody is capable of being his best and of being fully present and invested with each wife. But Cody only does it when he feels all the way in emotionally. Otherwise, he doesn't bother. And his new improved behavior wasn't because he grew as a husband at all. He was always capable of this behavior, but his heart wasn't in it, and his emotions weren't deeply intertwined. So Cody just phoned it in. He didn't grow as a person and improve. He was invested because he felt all in and he wanted to. But he was always capable and he always knew how he should ideally behave with each wife, in my opinion. He just didn't care enough to make that effort. If it wasn't natural to him from the heart, he just didn't do it. In my opinion, Cody seemed more devoted to the cause with Christine because he knew her status in the church and he married her, in my opinion, for that status to some extent. And he knew he had to invest. He couldn't phone it in with Christine. She wouldn't accept that. It's also interesting that Mary says Cody grew as a person and that accounted for Cody attending to Christine's wants and needs, and that he was more invested in Christine than Janelle. Yet with Christine, he didn't even plan or consider going on a honeymoon till Christine was disappointed that he didn't plan a honeymoon. So how much did Cody grow as a husband if he did a honeymoon road trip somewhat planned for Janelle and Mary? But for Christine, he didn't anticipate having a honeymoon. He overlooked considering or even planning a honeymoon. And then when Christine was disappointed, he threw her in a car and drove her around the sticks of Montana, acting distant and doom and gloom, not wanting to be there. If he grew so much as a husband and learned so much, how did he remember a honeymoon for Mary, wife number 1, and for Janelle, wife number 2? But on the third go-round with wife number 3, a honeymoon just skipped his mind. How much did Cody improve, and how much investment and attunement did Cody really have with Christine? As far as Cody only calling Mary once, it seems rather cruel. And of course, because Christine was perceived as another romantic love to Mary and a threat, just getting one call probably added fuel to an out-of-control narrative that must have spinned in her mind that Christine's love with Cody was deeper and more important to Cody than her love with Cody. In my opinion, the different level of investment in Christine that Mary perceived was all for show to seal the deal with Christine, Knowing she was head over heels and he needed to lock it down if he wanted to, marry her knowing her status in the church. And Christine was young and naive, so it was easy to showboat and please her. Cody had Christine eating out of the palm of his hand. And notice on the wedding day, he was distant and morose and cold, and it continued into the honeymoon. And Christine was shocked that this was the same Cody Brown she was infatuated with. He flipped almost immediately. That must have been anxiety-provoking and scary for her. She expected a happy-go-lucky, charming guy, only to discover the other side of Cody once she was already married to him. Mary had a hard time with Cody and Christine's courtship, but she was surprised at how quickly she and Christine became friends. How was she surprised? They were supposedly besties before. Remember when Cody initially was hesitant to court Christine because he and Christine were Mary's only friends in the world, her closest friends, and Cody didn't want Mary to feel abandoned if they were to court and date and leave Mary home alone? Later, Cody shifted a few paragraphs into that chapter, and he said that they weren't good friends. Mary liked Christine. Here, Mary is saying she was surprised how quickly they became friends, even though she had a hard time with their courtship. And we know Mary refused to even consider courting Christine many times when they were friends before, according to Cody. Cody and Mary knew Christine for 3 years, but Mary was surprised that even though the courtship was hard on her, she and Christine quickly became friends. So many contradictions. It's unbelievable, even in the book itself, not even just from the show to the book, we see these contradictions. When Christine married Cody, she chose not to live at Janelle and Mary's house. She had her own home. Christine wanted her own experience with Cody before having the joining the family experience. Christine moved into a nearby cottage, and that meant Cody would spend several nights a week away from his home, and Mary and Janelle, but it seemed like a healthier and more reasonable choice for everyone involved. Mary says her friendship with Christine didn't happen overnight, but Christine's fun and outgoing personality livened up the mood in their household. Christine and Mary learned they both shared a silliness, and they would often embarrass Janelle with their antics. That's not surprising. Janelle has mentioned more than once being embarrassed by how her sister wives behave when they are silly, goofing off in public. During the confessional, after the wives went to the grocery store to make dinner for their guests in the Polygamous Party episode, when Mary, Christine, and Robin were goofing off at the grocery store recounting their antics, Janelle said she was glad not to go, and she gets embarrassed by her sister wives. So that is consistent, and there are other times in the show that she voices being embarrassed. Janelle has been embarrassed many times as the wives are goofing off. Christine and Mary had an easier relationship than Mary had with Janelle, but when Christine got pregnant, Mary felt disappointed. It was 5 years into her marriage with Cody. Mary was starting to worry she would never have a baby. When Christine was 4 months pregnant with her oldest child, Cody urged Mary to take a pregnancy test after she was late, which wasn't unusual for her. She took the test and she was pregnant, and she was so overjoyed. The next morning, Janelle and Mary went to pick up Cody and Christine for church at Christine's house, and she was so excited to tell Cody the news. But she wanted to tell Cody the good news privately. In the middle of church, Cody remembered the pregnancy test. He glanced over at Mary knowingly and looked at her stomach, and Mary nodded, and Cody smiled, and tears came to his eyes. Mary and Cody were ecstatic that what they wanted since they married finally came to be. Mary was worried that Christine would have a hard time with her pregnancy. Christine was new to the family and 4 months pregnant, and Mary was finally pregnant after her 5-year struggle at the same time as Christine. And Mary knew she was carrying a miracle baby, and she didn't want to steal Christine's thunder since she was pregnant as well. Mary feared the focus would shift from Christine to her, and she didn't blame Christine, being resentful of her for that. Mary didn't dwell on Christine's resentment. She was so overjoyed she finally got to have a child. Mary was sure she would have more kids after Mariah was born. Mary always wanted 8 kids. Cody and Mary had discussed it before, but after Mariah, Mary was never able to have more kids. She and Cody tried everything they could to conceive, from medical doctors to holistic healers, to no avail. The hardest thing for Mary was knowing she was the one with the fertility issues. She struggled to come to terms with this. She felt defective. And Cody had no problem fertility-wise because Christine and Janelle got pregnant often and easily. I really can't imagine how heartbreaking it is to know you want to be a mother desperately and you want a house full of kids and you struggle for 5 years and you get one child as you watch your sister wives easily get pregnant and have child after child and you feel like your body betrayed you. It's probably very heavy and difficult, and to experience the trauma on repeat as each wife has a new child must hurt deeply and cause so much suffering and sadness. Cody never made Mary feel bad about her not being able to get pregnant again, but Mary felt her sister wives used their pregnancies to validate their marriages to Cody in a way she could not. Mary knew her sister wives were not flaunting their fertility intentionally, but because she struggled with her infertility issues, Mary wondered what place she had in the family. By the time Mariah was 12, Mary had given up hope of having another child, but out of the blue, she got pregnant. But she lost that baby after only a couple of months. That's absolutely devastating, to out of the blue be blessed with something you lost hope for that you dreamt of and wanted so much with all of your heart, and then unexpectedly to get it out of the blue and then to have that dream smashed again. Wow, that's beyond devastating. And the amount of grief and the amount of hope and the amount of despair is something that you have to be tough as nails to get through and endure. And you have to be a strong woman. And Mary inside her has to be very strong. I can't imagine. I probably need a grief counselor to cope with that. Mary was devastated, but she knew she had to be content with the blessing she had in Mariah. Mary never had any more babies after that. Mary loved working with the at-risk youth, and she loves kids, and I wish she could adopt or foster kids. I could see Mary being great at that, and she seems to have a lot of love to give, and there are a lot of kids who would love to have a home and to be loved. That does it for this episode of Becoming Sister Wives Book Club. Next week, I'll cover part 2 of chapter 5 on Mary, and I'll be covering season 2, episode 9 in my Sister Wives Rewatch. That episode is entitled No Place for Home. To my YouTube viewers, please like, subscribe, and tell me your thoughts in the comments section. I love to hear your perspectives. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week. Bye.